Gavin Newsom entered the CNN broadcast studio with his signature swept-back hair impeccably styled, and a $5,000 suit tailored to perfection, prepared to deliver a lecture to the American public regarding the virtues of progressive values. J. D. Vance, however, observed a governor born into a trust fund whose state was grappling with severe public sanitation crises, a leader who had famously enjoyed $350 per person dinners at the French Laundry during the height of the pandemic lockdowns. The polished veneer of expensive hair products was about to collide head-on with the disciplined documentation of a United States Marine. CNN had organized the event under the banner of presenting two distinct visions for America, anticipating that they would showcase Newsom's coastal sophistication in stark contrast to what they presumed would be a Rust Belt extremist. The network executives had absolutely no conception that the junior senator from Ohio had spent the preceding 3 weeks meticulously compiling irrefutable evidence of California's systemic societal breakdown. This was not a collection of abstract theories regarding progressive failures, but rather hard data, including actual photographs of tent encampments stretching for miles, and Census Bureau data indicating 500,000 residents fleeing the R's state. There were business records verifying that industry giants like Tesla, Oracle, and Hewlett-Packard had abandoned California in favor of Texas, alongside cost-of-living comparisons, highlighting an $800,000 median home price in California against a $200,000 equivalent in Ohio. Furthermore, Vance possessed dozens of photographs of Newsom at that infamous French Laundry dinner, unmasked and laughing with lobbyists, at the very moment Californians were barred from visiting their dying relatives in hospitals. What transpired over the subsequent 90 minutes would compel Gavin Newsom to defend a state suffering from the most severe homelessness crisis in America, despite an expenditure of $24 billion intended to solve the problem. He would be forced to answer for a state losing population for the first time in its history, a place where the middle class had faced extinction, replaced by a dichotomy of tech billionaires and homeless encampments, with nothing remaining in between. If you have ever desired to witness someone confront Newsom regarding the 28,000 reports of human waste on the streets of San Francisco, while he was dining on $350 meals, this was the moment. The anticipation built as Vance prepared to reveal photographs of homeless camps situated directly outside Newsom's own private mansion, proving that the governor's perfect styling could not shield him from the reality of his governance. The CNN studio was filled to capacity with 400 individuals, carefully balanced between Newsom's California supporters and what the network assumed would be a significantly smaller contingent of Vance supporters. They had miscalculated the sentiment of the room. As it turned out, a vast number of Americans were exhausted by watching California fail while its governor lectured the rest of the country. Gavin Newsom entered first to enthusiastic applause from his designated section, appearing youthful at 56, likely due to what observers whispered was the result of very expensive skincare regimens. He possessed that hair perfectly styled backward, that expensive suit fitting as if it were painted onto his frame, and that smile he had been practicing since his days as a nephew of the Getty family being groomed for political office. He appeared as though he had just stepped out of a luxury magazine spread dedicated to successful governance. J.D. Vance walked out 30 seconds later, 39 years old with a Marine Corps haircut, wearing a plain suit that likely cost a fraction of Newsom's and carrying 3 thick binders, which he set down on the table with a heavy thud that everyone could hear. The visual contrast was immediate and striking, as one man looked ready for a high-fashion photo shoot while the other looked prepared for serious work. Jake Tapper commenced his introduction, speaking about civil discourse and the importance of learning from different state models. Newsom smiled and nodded along as if he were already the president, while Vance sat quietly, flipping through his folders. "Governor Newsom, your opening statement, please," Tapper requested. Newsom deployed that smooth, resonant voice he had perfected over decades in the political arena. "Thank you, Jake. California stands as the fifth largest economy in the world, and we lead on climate change, on social justice, and on innovation. Yes, we have challenges, as every state does, but we face them with bold, progressive solutions, and we believe in science over superstition, compassion over cruelty, and the future over the past." He turned to look directly at Vance with a practiced sense of gravitas. Senator Vance represents the old America, the America being left behind by history. While Ohio is shrinking, California grows. For we are the future, and he is the past, and America will choose its direction. His supporters applauded enthusiastically, and he sat back looking satisfied with his performance. Vance smiled, but it was not a friendly smile. It was the smile of a Marine who had just been handed a tactical opportunity. "Gavin, I am going to correct something you just said because California isn't growing, it is shrinking. You lost population, and you lost a congressional seat for the first time in your state's history. Ohio is gaining jobs and people, but let us not argue about it. Let me simply show you." He opened his first folder, and the studio screens lit up with an image that made Newsom's smile instantly disappear. Nothing communicates that we are all in this together, quite like $350 dinners, while banning everyone else's Thanksgiving. The photograph filled every screen in the studio, depicting Gavin Newsom at an elegant table at the French Laundry restaurant, surrounded by at least a dozen people, all unmasked and all clearly indoors, despite later claims it was outdoor dining, all laughing and enjoying themselves. The photo was dated November 6, 2020. Vance allowed the image to remain on the screen for a long moment, and the silence in the room was devastating. November 6, 2020, the middle of the pandemic. Do you remember this dinner? Gavin Newsom shifted in his chair, visibly uncomfortable. I addressed that incident at the time and acknowledged my mistake. $350 per person, Vance interrupted. That is what investigative journalists confirmed this meal cost. A minimum of $350 per person at one of America's most expensive restaurants. Vance pulled out more documents, and the screens changed to show Newsom's own words from that very same week in November. "Do not gather with anyone outside your household. Keep all activities outdoors only. Wear masks at all times when outside your home. We are all in this together." Vance read each rule slowly, letting the weight of the words land with impact. "Those were your explicit orders to Californians. Do not gather, outdoors only, masks always. We are in this together." He gestured to the photograph still visible on a secondary screen. "But you gathered with 12 people, you went indoors, nobody wore masks, and you definitely were not in it together with the people losing everything because of your lockdowns." The audience was completely silent now, and even Newsom's supporters looked uncomfortable staring at that photograph. "Let me tell you what was happening to regular Californians while you were eating your expensive meal," Vance continued, his voice hardening. "Families were canceling Thanksgiving because you told them it was illegal to gather. A grandmother in Sacramento could not see her grandchildren for the holidays because of your orders, and small restaurants and family businesses that had been operating for decades were going bankrupt because you banned indoor dining for everyone, except apparently yourself." Vance pulled out news clippings and photographs appeared on the screen, showing a shuttered restaurant with a sign saying "closed permanently after 47 years, thanks to restrictions," a woman crying outside her closed bakery, and a family holding a sign through a hospital window because they could not visit their dying father inside. These are real people. Gavin, a woman named Maria Gonzalez in Los Angeles, who lost her restaurant that her parents had opened in 1976, a man named Robert Chen, who could not be with his father when he died because you banned hospital visitors, and kids who missed an entire year of school because you kept schools closed while your own kids had private tutors. Newsom tried to interrupt, claiming the public health emergency required difficult choices. You were not making difficult decisions for everyone. Vance's voice rose, and the Marine intensity came through. You were making difficult decisions for them while you ate expensive dinners with medical lobbyists. He pulled out the guest list and read the names, noting the CEO of the California Medical Association was at this dinner, along with multiple healthcare lobbyists with direct financial interests in your policies, breaking bread with you, while you decided whether regular Californians could break bread with their own families. Vance stood up now, too animated to remain seated. I was a Marine in Iraq, and you know what they taught us about leadership? Mission first. Troops always. Leaders eat last. Leaders sacrifice first. Leaders do not tell everyone else to tighten their belts while loosening their own. He walked toward center stage, letting the silence hang before continuing. Your apology was perfect, though. You said, and I am quoting here, I should have modeled better behavior. Should have modeled? Gavin, you were not modeling anything. You were breaking laws that you yourself had written. That is not poor modeling. That is hypocrisy. That is let them eat cake. Except you were literally eating very expensive cake at the French Laundry, while Californians went hungry because their businesses were shuttered. Vance turned to face the audience. Ohio stayed open during the pandemic. We protected the vulnerable like we should have. Elderly folks and immune-compromised people, we helped them. But we didn't destroy everyone else's lives. Kids stayed in school, small businesses survived, people kept their dignity and their livelihoods. He turned back to Newsom. Your lockdowns killed more businesses than the virus did. Your state had the highest unemployment despite the strictest lockdowns. The worst educational outcomes despite keeping kids home the longest. And you violated your own orders to wine and dine with lobbyists. The final line came with quiet intensity. That is not leadership. That is aristocracy. And that is exactly what America fought a revolution against. The applause from Vance's section was deafening, and even some of Newsom's people sat in uncomfortable silence, contemplating the hypocrisy of medical lobbyists dining while Thanksgiving was banned. Vance did not wait for Jake Tapper to moderate the conversation, as he was already pulling out his second folder, and the screens were changing to show images that made people in the audience gasp. These were not small encampments, but massive tent cities, stretching for blocks in Los Angeles and downtown San Francisco, with people openly injecting drugs on sidewalks, while business people in suits walked past piles of trash and human waste on streets that once housed luxury boutiques, with needles scattered across children's playgrounds. California has 171,000 homeless people, Vance began, and the number appeared on the screen. That is 30% of America's entire homeless population. Let me say that again, because it is almost impossible to believe one state with 12% of America's population has 30% of all homeless Americans. Newsom started to respond, but Vance spoke over him. And you have half of America's unsheltered homeless, 50%, people living in tents on streets, in the richest state in the Union. The images on screen shifted to show the progression over years. Not just single snapshots, but a timeline from 2017, when Newsom was lieutenant governor and the problem was already visible, to 2019, when he became governor and promised a comprehensive solution, to 2021, when he announced billions in new funding, and finally to 2023, when the crisis had grown worse despite all that money. Each year, the tent cities grew larger, spread to new neighborhoods, and became more entrenched. The photos told a story of failure compounding over time. Since 2019, you have spent $24 billion on homelessness. Vance let that number hang in the air for a long moment, wanting everyone to really absorb the scale. 24 billion with a B. That is 24,000 million if you are keeping track at home, which is more than the entire GDP of some small countries. He walked toward the screen, showing a massive tent encampment under a Los Angeles freeway overpass, an image shocking even to people who had seen homeless problems before, with hundreds of tents stretching in both directions, trash piled high, people lying on sidewalks, and kids walking past on their way to school. I had my staff do some basic arithmetic, 24 billion divided by 171,000 homeless people. Do you want to know what that equals? $140,350 per person. He paused to let that calculation sink in. That is not a typo. Over $140,000 per homeless person. You could have bought each person a house. A nice 3-bedroom house with a yard and a garage in most of America. Hell, in some parts of the country, you could buy 2 houses for that. Instead, the screen showed what that money had actually bought. Bigger tent cities, more needles scattered on playgrounds, more human waste on sidewalks, more disease, more despair, and more death. The photos were chronological, showing the problem getting visibly worse year after year, despite the spending increasing. In 2019, California had 151,000 homeless. Today, after you spent $24 billion, you have 171,000. Let me repeat that, because I want to make sure everyone understands. The problem got worse. 20,000 more human beings are living on streets and in tents after you spent enough money to house every single one of them multiple times over. Vance's voice changed from presenting numbers to something that sounded like genuine moral outrage. Where did that money go? Because it sure as hell didn't go to homeless people. It didn't go to building them housing or getting them treatment or helping them get jobs. It went to consultants, 6-figure consultants studying the problem and writing reports that nobody reads. It went to nonprofits run by your political allies, paying themselves executive salaries while accomplishing nothing. It went to new bureaucracies and coordinators and administrators whose job is to coordinate with other coordinators about administrative coordination. He pulled out specific examples reading from audit reports with page numbers and citations. Los Angeles hired a homelessness coordinator at $275,000 a year. That is one person's salary to coordinate while people live in tents. The city spent $1 billion claiming they would build housing for the homeless, producing 1,200 units, which is $837,000 per unit. Vance pulled out a real estate listing and held it up. I can show you mansions in Ohio selling for less than that, 4,000-square-foot mansions with pools and 5-car garages. But in your progressive paradise, 800,000 gets you a 400-square-foot efficiency that took 5 years to build because of your environmental reviews and union requirements and building codes and regulations that make actually helping people impossible. The images shifted to San Francisco, and Vance's voice dropped to something that sounded like personal disgust, like he was forcing himself to describe something that made him physically sick. Your city, Gavin, where you were mayor from 2004 to 2011, where you built your political reputation as a progressive problem solver. They have a map now, not a tourist map, not a restaurant map, but a human waste map. He showed the infamous application on the screen, zooming in slowly so everyone could see the dense clusters of brown dots. This is a real smartphone application that the city officially supports, where people report human waste on the streets of San Francisco, and each brown dot is a report. Count them if you want. There are 28,000 in 1 year 28,000 separate reports of human waste on public sidewalks in one of the most beautiful and historically important cities in America. Vance zoomed in on particular neighborhoods, showing the concentration. These aren't accidents. These aren't one-off incidents. This is open sanitation failure as a normalized part of daily life. Business owners hosing down their sidewalks every morning before opening, parents walking children to school past biological hazards, tourists stepping in it outside four-star restaurants, charging $200 a plate. The screen changed to show news reports about disease outbreaks, and Vance read the headlines slowly, letting each word land. Medieval diseases are coming back to California. Typhus, a disease we eliminated in the developed world decades ago. Hepatitis A, outbreaks among the homeless population spreading to the general public, and even actual bubonic plague cases in 21st century America in California because your progressive policies created third-world sanitation conditions in the world's richest state. Vance pulled out news articles and read headlines about Walgreens closing 17 locations in San Francisco due to theft and unsanitary conditions, Union Square luxury stores boarding up windows, and tourism to San Francisco dropping 40% because families won't walk downtown and conventions are canceling. Your policies destroyed one of the most beautiful cities in the world. He turned back to Newsom, who sat, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. In Ohio, our homeless rate is 0.1%. That is not a typo, 0.1%. You know why? Because we don't let people use drugs openly on streets. We don't allow permanent tent cities. We have rules, and we enforce them, and we actually help people instead of enabling their destruction. Vance walked closer to Newsom's chair. You spent enough money to buy every homeless person a house, but instead, you have tent cities that look like refugee camps, diseases that we eradicated a century ago, and human waste maps on smartphones. That is not compassion. That is not progressive. That is failure so complete it should be studied as a warning to future generations. The silence in the studio was total, as even Newsom's most ardent supporters could not defend images of tent cities and sanitation maps. The screens changed again before anyone could process the homelessness devastation, this time showing moving trucks and U-Hauls heading east, families packing, and businesses with relocated to Texas signs. California lost population. Vance began simply. For the first time in state history, more people left than came. Between 2020 and 2023, over 500,000 more people left California than moved in. Newsom tried to speak, but Vance held up a hand. You lost a congressional seat, the first time ever. That is how bad the exodus is. You literally lost political representation because so many people fled your policies. The numbers appeared on the screen, but Vance narrated them like a story. Net loss of 511,000 people over 3 years, families leaving, businesses relocating, retirees cashing out, and young people who cannot afford to start their lives all fleeing California. He pulled out migration data showing where they went. Texas gained over 100,000 Californians. Florida got tens of thousands more. Tennessee, Arizona, Nevada, and yes, Ohio gained California refugees too. People voting with their feet. Vance walked toward the center. Let us talk about who is leaving. Not the ultra-wealthy, for tech billionaires can afford your California. Not the homeless, obviously, since they cannot afford to leave. Who is fleeing is the middle class. Teachers, firefighters, nurses, small business owners, the people who make society actually function. The screen showed average home prices, and Vance narrated the comparison. The median home in California is $820,000, while in Ohio it is $200,000. The same house is 4 times more expensive. A teacher in Sacramento making $60,000 a year cannot afford to buy a home ever. Not a starter home, not a fixer-upper, nothing. But that same teacher moves to Columbus, and they can buy a nice 3-bedroom house and still have money left over. He pulled out rental comparisons showing the average rent in California is $3,200 a month, while the national average is $1,700 and Ohio is $1,100. Working families are spending half their income on rent, and they cannot save anything, cannot buy a house, cannot build equity, and cannot get ahead. So, they leave. Vance shifted to the business exodus, and the screen filled with corporate logos. Tesla left, and Elon Musk explicitly cited your policies when he moved headquarters to Texas. Oracle relocated to Austin. Hewlett-Packard, the company that basically created Silicon Valley, left for Texas. Toyota moved their headquarters out. Charles Schwab relocated, and SpaceX moved operations. Dozens of major corporations abandoned California. He read from a list of companies letting each name land. These aren't just buildings relocating. These are jobs, careers, opportunities, tax revenue, and economic activity, all fleeing California for states with lower taxes, fewer regulations, and governments that actually want businesses to succeed. Newsom finally managed to interrupt, claiming many businesses are still choosing California for talent and innovation. Your talent is leaving, Vance shot back. Tech workers are moving to Austin and Miami and Nashville because they can afford to live there. You keep the billionaires who can afford $20 million mansions, but everyone else flees. The screen showed demographic data, and Vance explained it like a story. Young families with kids are leaving fastest. Birth rates in California are collapsing, and schools are closing from lack of enrollment. The future is literally leaving your state. He walked back toward his chair, preparing for his conclusion on this segment. People do not abandon paradise, Gavin. They do not flee opportunity. They flee failure. Your high taxes, insane regulations, terrible schools, crime, homelessness, and cost of living have made California unlivable for anyone who is not ultra-rich or ultra-poor. Vance picked up a prop his staff had prepared, a simple outline of California with an arrow pointing east. This is your legacy. 500,000 people fleeing, a congressional seat lost, the middle class extinct, businesses relocating, and young families leaving. That is not the California dream. That is the California nightmare. The final line was delivered quietly, but firmly. Ohio is growing. Businesses are moving in. Intel just announced a $20 billion factory in my state. Young families are buying homes, and we are doing what you are failing at, and we are doing it without human waste maps. Vance grabbed his next folder, and the screens filled with a simple image of 2 houses side by side, identical in size, with 3 bedrooms and 2 baths and a nice yard. One was labeled California $800,000, the other labeled Ohio $200,000. Let us talk about cost of living, because this is where your progressive policies really hurt working people. Newsom tried to preempt him, arguing California's higher costs reflect higher wages and quality of life. A teacher in Sacramento makes $62,000 a year, Vance interrupted, while a teacher in Columbus makes $58,000, which is $4,000 more in California, but that house costs $600,000 more. The California teacher is poorer, even though they make more on paper. The screen showed the math. Housing costs, transportation costs, food costs, and energy costs were all higher in California. Gas in California costs $6 a gallon right now, Vance continued, while in Ohio it is $3.50. Your working families spend twice as much just getting to work. And that is because of your gas taxes and environmental regulations that you claim are saving the planet while bankrupting families. He pulled out utility bills showing electricity in California costs 80% more than the national average. 80%, meaning working families are choosing between air conditioning and groceries because you mandate solar and wind that do not always work, and closed your nuclear plants that did. Vance, let that sink in before continuing. Food costs more, childcare costs more, car insurance costs more, everything costs more. And your solution is to tell people to buy electric cars they cannot afford and eat organic food that costs triple. The images shifted to show grocery store receipts with prices circled, showing the same items and same brands being 40% more expensive in California. A family is spending an extra $400 a month on groceries just because you regulate everything. He walked toward the audience. Your minimum wage is $16 an hour. Ohio's is 10 to 10, which sounds great, right? Higher wages? Except that studio apartment in Los Angeles costs $3,000 a month, while in Columbus, it is $900. The Ohio minimum wage worker can actually afford to live, while your California worker needs 3 roommates. Vance pulled out the most damning statistic. California has America's highest poverty rate when you adjust for cost of living. Highest despite being the richest state. Despite all your progressive policies claiming to help the poor. When you account for what things actually cost. California has the most poverty. He let that contradiction hang in the air. You have tech billionaires in Palo Alto worth $100 billion, and you have working families in the Central Valley living in cars because they cannot afford rent. That is not income inequality. That is a failure of governance so complete that the middle class has been eliminated. The screen showed a graph of income distribution in California, with a massive spike at the top for the ultra-wealthy, a huge spike at the bottom for the poor, and almost nothing in the middle. This is your California, Vance explained, pointing at the hollowed-out middle. Billionaires and homeless, tech executives and tent cities, nothing in between. The secretary and the mechanic, and the nurse and the teacher, the people who make society work, cannot afford to live there anymore. Newsom was shaking his head, but Vance pressed on. You personally are worth about $20 million. You grew up in the Getty family world of privilege. You have never worried about rent. You have never chosen between groceries and gas, and you have never felt what it is like to make a good salary and still be poor because everything costs so much. He walked closer to Newsom. That secretary paying $3,000 a month for a studio apartment while making $45,000 a year, she is poor in your California. That same secretary moves to Ohio. She is paying $900 a month and has money left over. Same job, same effort. One state she is drowning, the other state she is thriving. Vance returned to his chair for the conclusion. Your policies help the very rich who can afford anything, and they hurt everyone else. That is why the middle class is fleeing. That is why you lost 500,000 people, because they could not afford your progressive paradise anymore. The screens changed to surveillance footage of a person walking into a Walgreens, filling a garbage bag with merchandise, and walking out past employees who did not even try to stop them. Then another clip, and another, showing dozens of thefts captured on camera. Proposition 47, Vance began. You supported this, and still support it. Let me explain what it does for people watching. If you steal less than $950 worth of goods, it is just a misdemeanor. Basically, no consequences. Show up to court maybe, probably not even that. The footage kept playing, showing organized groups clearing shelves, walking out with cartloads, nobody stopping them. So criminal enterprises figured it out real quick. Send people in, take $949 worth, walk out, and do it again at the next store. California became a shoplifter's paradise. Vance pulled out business closure data. Walgreens closed 17 stores in San Francisco alone. CVS closed multiple locations. Target started locking up toothpaste and deodorant behind plexiglass, and luxury stores in Union Square boarded up windows not because of the pandemic, but because of theft. The screen showed photos of high-end retail stores with plywood over windows, security guards at every door, and merchandise locked in cases. "This is San Francisco now," Vance narrated, "the luxury retail capital of the West Coast, and you have to lock up everything because your laws made stealing consequence-free." He pulled out worker testimony of a CVS employee in Los Angeles who watched people fill bags with merchandise 5 times a day, every single day, unable to stop them due to company policy and liability concerns. The thieves knew it and would literally laugh at employees and walk out. Newsom tried to interrupt, saying Prop 47 was about criminal justice reform and not filling prisons. It was about letting criminals run wild. Vance cut him off. About prioritizing thieves over workers and businesses. About making life easy for criminals and impossible for everyone else. The images shifted to violent crime statistics, showing that since Prop 47 passed, property crime was up 32%. Organized retail theft rings were operating openly. Fentanyl deaths were skyrocketing because drugs were decriminalized, and streets that were safe are now dangerous. Vance pulled out specific incidents reading from police reports. A woman beaten unconscious in broad daylight in San Francisco by a suspect who had been arrested 7 times that month and released every time, attacking her on his 8th crime spree. Your policies did that. He showed more examples, such as a man pushed onto subway tracks by an attacker who had 37 prior arrests and was still walking free because your progressive DA wouldn't prosecute. The man almost died, but at least you were compassionate to the criminal. The screen showed a map of store closures across California with dozens of red dots representing permanent closures. Every one of those dots is a closed business, Vance explained. Jobs lost, tax revenue gone, communities without services, elderly people without nearby pharmacies, food deserts in major cities, all because you made crime legal and defense impossible. He walked toward Newsom. In Ohio, if you steal, you get arrested. You get prosecuted. You face consequences. So, guess what? We don't have organized retail theft rings. We don't have stores closing from theft. We don't lock toothpaste behind plexiglass. We have law and order. Vance's voice rose with intensity. Your progressive prosecutor friends like Chesa Boudin, who you supported, wouldn't prosecute crimes, practicing catch and release, arrest and release, over and over. The same criminals terrorizing communities while you talked about compassion and reform. The final image showed a boarded-up Walgreens with graffiti and a homeless encampment outside. This is progressive governance. This is what you did to California. You made it safe for criminals and dangerous for everyone else. Vance pulled out his final prepared folder, and the screens showed a darkened city skyline, with no lights, no power, just darkness. California had rolling blackouts during summer heat waves. Vance began in 2020, 2022, and 2023. The richest state in America telling people not to charge their electric cars because the grid cannot handle it. Newsom started to explain about the renewable energy transition, but Vance spoke over him. You are mandating electric cars by 2035. All new cars must be electric, but you cannot keep the power on now. How is that going to work when everyone needs to charge cars? The screen showed the emergency alerts California sent during blackouts, asking people to conserve electricity between 4 and 9 p.m., do not charge electric vehicles, and set thermostats to 85 degrees. This is what you sent while it was 100 degrees outside. Vance pulled out electricity bills, showing California has the highest electricity costs in America, 83% higher than the national average. Working families are choosing between air conditioning and paying rent because your green energy mandates do not work. He showed solar and wind capacity versus actual production. You closed your nuclear plants that provided 24/7 clean power. Diablo Canyon could have run for decades more, but you shut it down for ideology, and now you beg Arizona and Nevada for power during peak hours. The images shifted to failed solar installations and wind farms sitting idle. Spent billions on renewables that only work when the sun shines and wind blows, but turns out people need electricity at night too. Who knew? The sarcasm was thick. Vance walked toward center stage. Ohio has reliable power 24/7. We use natural gas, nuclear, and yes, some renewables. But we prioritize actually keeping the lights on over virtue signaling about being green. He pulled out the contradiction. You mandate electric cars, but cannot provide electricity. You close power plants, but demand more power. And you raise costs so high that working families cannot afford air conditioning. That is not environmentalism. That is fantasy meeting reality and losing. The final image showed a Tesla charging station with a sign saying, "Charging prohibited 4 to 9 p.m. during grid emergency." You are telling people to buy electric cars they cannot afford, charging them with electricity that does not exist, at prices they cannot pay, in a state they are fleeing. Vance let that sink in. That is California in a nutshell. Blackouts. While mandating electric cars and the highest electricity costs. Jake Tapper tried to moderate toward closing statements, but Vance stood up from his chair. Actually, Jake, I want to make something clear before we finish, because I think this entire debate comes down to one fundamental difference between me and Governor Newsom. He walked to center stage, leaving his folders behind. I grew up poor in Appalachia. My mother struggled with addiction, and my grandmother raised me in a town that was dying economically. I joined the Marines, served in Iraq, used the GI Bill to go to Ohio State, and worked my way through Yale Law School. I know what struggle looks like, because I lived it. He turned to face Newsom directly. You grew up in the Getty family world. Your father was a judge. You went to private schools, and you have been connected to wealth and power your entire life. You have never worried about making rent, never chosen between groceries and gas, and never felt what it is like to be working class in America. Vance walked closer, and that difference shows in everything. Your policies help the very rich who can afford them and hurt everyone else. My policies focus on working people because I was one and still am in my heart. He began counting on his fingers. You ate expensive dinners while banning Thanksgiving for families. I ate MREs in Iraq while defending America. You spent $24 billion on homelessness, and it got worse. I focus on jobs and opportunity so people do not become homeless. You created laws that made theft legal. I believe in law and order. You made California unaffordable for the middle class. I am making Ohio affordable for working families. You mandate electric cars but cannot provide electricity. I focus on reliable energy that people can afford. You have driven 500,000 people out of California. I am attracting businesses and families to Ohio. Vance spread his arms wide. Every single issue we have discussed tonight comes down to this. Do you care more about looking progressive and virtuous, or do you care about actual results for actual people? He pointed at the screen, still showing tent cities and closed businesses. Your California has the worst homelessness, highest poverty when adjusted for cost of living, most expensive housing, highest taxes, and worst education despite highest spending, most crime, least affordable living, and biggest exodus of working families in America. His voice rose. But you feel good about it because you banned plastic straws and mandate solar panels and say the right things about social justice. Meanwhile, working people cannot afford to live there. Vance walked back toward his chair for his conclusion. I am a Marine, and we measure success by mission accomplishment. Did you achieve the objective? Your objective should be Californians thriving, but instead they are fleeing. That is mission failure. He sat down and delivered his final assessment. California is a warning about what happens when progressive policies meet reality, when virtue signaling meets governance, when caring more about feeling good than doing good takes priority. It is a cautionary tale that every American should understand before these policies spread nationwide. The pause was long and heavy. Governor Newsom wants to bring California's policies to America. I want to bring Ohio's results to America. And working people should decide which they would rather have. The standing ovation from Vance's section lasted 5 full minutes, and even some of Newsom's supporters looked troubled, staring at those images of tent cities and remembering those expensive dinners. Newsom sat in his chair, his perfect hair still somehow perfect, but everything else about him looking diminished. The slick facade had cracked against actual evidence. The smooth words had failed against real results. The trust fund governor had met the working-class Marine, and the receipts had won. The video went viral immediately, in a way that transcended typical partisan sharing. This was not just conservatives passing around clips to confirm their worldview. This was actually crossing ideological lines because Vance hadn't attacked with abstract conservative principles or culture war rhetoric. He had attacked with photographs of tent cities that anyone could see were real, census data that anyone could verify, business relocations that were documented public record, and a photograph of Newsom at French Laundry that the governor himself had been forced to acknowledge and apologize for years earlier. Within 12 hours, the full debate had accumulated 53 million views across YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, and newer platforms. That was not counting the edited clips and reaction videos that were multiplying exponentially. The French Laundry segment alone got 22 million views as a standalone clip. The homeless crisis section got 18 million, and the cost of living comparison got 15 million. People were watching, sharing, and discussing in a way that political debates rarely achieved. Within 48 hours, the view count hit 127 million. And the debate had penetrated mainstream consciousness in a way that made it unavoidable. Cable news networks that might have preferred to ignore or minimize it found they couldn't because their own audiences were asking about it. CNN had hosted the debate, so they had to cover their own event, though their anchors kept trying to provide context that would soften Vance's attacks. MSNBC brought on California Democrats to defend Newsom's record. But even sympathetic hosts had trouble explaining away photographs of tent cities and the $24 billion in spending that made the problem worse. The French Laundry segment became its own separate viral phenomenon beyond the debate itself, with TikTok users who normally posted about fashion or music or dance-creating videos juxtaposing Newsom's expensive dinner with footage of small businesses that had closed permanently because of his lockdown orders. The contrast was so stark, the hypocrisy so visual and undeniable, that even young people who did not particularly care about politics found themselves sharing it. The image of Newsom unmasked and laughing with lobbyists, while ordinary Californians could not visit dying relatives, became a symbol of elite disconnection that resonated across partisan divides. The homeless crisis footage proved devastating for Newsom's national ambitions in ways that went beyond conservative criticism. Progressive Democrats in other states started actively distancing themselves from California-style homelessness policy because their own constituents were showing them the viral videos and asking why they would want to replicate failure. Mayors in blue cities facing their own smaller homeless problems did not want to be compared to Los Angeles or San Francisco, and governors in purple states facing competitive elections, wanted nothing to do with policies that had produced such visible disaster. The Exodus data hurt Newsom perhaps most among Democrats themselves, particularly in the purple states that would determine any presidential primary. Voters in Georgia who had fled California in recent years shared the clips with friends explaining why they had left, while voters in Arizona and Nevada who had watched California influx drive up their own housing costs saw the debate as validation of their frustration. Even liberal voters in these states found themselves nodding along to Vance's critique because they did not want their own states turned into unaffordable playgrounds where only tech billionaires could live, while the middle class disappeared. Cable news played segments from the debate on loop for days. CNN tried desperately to provide context that would rehabilitate Newsom, bringing on friendly analysts who pointed out that California's size meant raw numbers would naturally be higher, that homelessness was a national problem, and that cost of living reflected desirability. But these defenses kept running into the visual evidence that viewers had already seen. You can explain away statistics, but you cannot explain away those photographs of tent cities, or that image of Newsom's expensive dinner, or those disease outbreak maps. MSNBC went even further in trying to defend Newsom, with some anchors suggesting Vance was exaggerating or cherry-picking data, but then their own viewers started sending in photos from California trips, showing tent cities that were exactly as bad as Vance described, started forwarding news articles from California papers about retail theft, forcing store closures, and started sharing their own electricity bills, showing the massive costs Vance had cited. The defense became untenable when the evidence was so easily verifiable. Fox News predictably celebrated for weeks. But more importantly, they used the debate as a launching pad for deeper investigative pieces about California's failures, sending reporters to document tent cities, interviewing business owners who had relocated to Texas or Florida or Tennessee, and showing families who had left California for more affordable states. The debate gave them a news peg to cover stories that demonstrated Vance's points in even greater detail. But the real impact showed up in polling data that political strategists in both parties studied intensely. Newsom's national favorability rating dropped 17 points in just 2 weeks following the debate, and his unfavorable rating spiked to 54%. With the increase coming not just from Republicans, but from independents and even some Democrats. Focus groups of Democratic primary voters in swing states showed dramatically declining enthusiasm for California-style progressive policies, with participants explicitly citing the debate as changing their minds. The damage went beyond Newsom personally to the broader progressive policy agenda he represented. Proposals for rent control, for example, suddenly faced more skepticism after voters had seen what California's rental market looked like. Climate policies involving electric vehicle mandates faced pushback after the blackout discussion, and criminal justice reform efforts had to explicitly distance themselves from Proposition 47 after seeing the retail theft footage. Newsom had become a cautionary tale that compromised the entire progressive platform. California Democrats began actively pressuring Newsom not to run for president, fearing he would become a drag on down-ballot candidates who would have to defend or distance themselves from his record. Moderate Democrats from purple states publicly suggested the party needed fresh voices and new approaches that were not tainted by California's failures. Even progressive Democrats worried that Newsom had become such a poor messenger for their policy preferences that he was actually setting back causes they cared about. Vance, meanwhile, experienced a meteoric rise in national stature. His favorability rating jumped 23 points in the month following the debate. Conservative donors who had been uncertain about him suddenly saw him as the future of the party and flooded his campaign account with contributions. Republican governors in purple states specifically requested he come campaign for them, knowing his working-class message and his ability to articulate conservative policy in terms of actual results rather than abstract principles, resonated with exactly the voters they needed. 6 months after the debate, Newsom made an announcement that surprised no one who had been watching his falling poll numbers and growing isolation within his own party. Standing at a podium in Sacramento with none of the usual political fanfare, looking somehow less polished than usual, he announced he would not run for president in 2028. The official reason given was his commitment to finishing his term as California governor and focusing on state issues. But the real reason was obvious to every political analyst, regardless of ideology. Vance had destroyed his national viability so thoroughly that a presidential run would have been humiliating. The announcement came without the usual speculation about future political ambitions or hints at later runs. There was no "not this time, but perhaps the future" language that politicians typically use to keep doors open. It was a final closing of the presidential door, a recognition that the debate had exposed California's failures too completely for national voters to overlook. Moderate Democrats privately expressed relief, happy to not have to defend tent cities and $24 billion in wasted spending, while progressive Democrats felt frustrated that their policy vision had been so damaged by Newsom's poor performance and California's visible problems. 1 year later, long after typical debate impacts fade from memory, the Vance-Newsom confrontation was still being referenced constantly in political discourse. Republican candidates at every level began using California-style policies as shorthand for progressive failure, always accompanied by clips from the debate showing tent cities and exodus numbers. Anytime a Democratic politician proposed something that resembled California's approach to homelessness or criminal justice or energy or cost of living, Republican opponents would immediately pull out the debate footage and ask if voters wanted their state to end up like California. The phrase, "Do you want to end up like California? We have the pod," became the most effective attack line in Republican campaigns across the country, particularly in purple states. Candidates would show the debate clips of tent cities and human waste maps, then ask voters if that is what they wanted for their communities. The attack worked because it was not abstract ideology or fear-mongering. It was visual evidence of policy failure that voters could see with their own eyes. Soccer moms in suburban Phoenix did not need to understand complex economic theory to know they did not want tent cities in their neighborhoods, and working-class dads in Wisconsin did not need policy papers to understand they could not afford $800,000 houses. The debate fundamentally altered how Americans viewed the California model that had been held up by progressives for years as aspirational. Before Vance's systematic takedown, California was frequently cited as proof that progressive policies could work at scale in a large, diverse state with a strong economy. After the debate, California became a warning label, a cautionary tale about what happens when progressive theory meets governing reality. The transformation was so complete that even many California Democrats began trying to distance their own policy proposals from their state's reputation. Vance's career trajectory validated the debate's impact. Within 18 months, serious political analysts were discussing him not as a potential vice presidential pick, but as a legitimate presidential candidate for 2028. His working-class background, combined with his ability to articulate conservative policy in terms of actual results rather than culture war grievances, made him uniquely positioned to compete in industrial Midwest states that decided recent elections. The debate had been his launching pad, proving he could go toe-to-toe with a nationally prominent Democrat and win decisively, not through attacks but through evidence. The Marine had beaten the trust fund governor, working-class results had beaten coastal elite rhetoric, and America had learned the lesson that progressive policies look great in theory but California proved they fail in practice. This was not a debate about competing philosophies in abstract. This was a confrontation between documented failure and working success, between a governor whose state was collapsing and a senator whose state was thriving, between expensive rhetoric and actual results. Gavin Newsom had spent decades perfecting his image: the perfect hair, the smooth delivery, the practiced empathy, the progressive credentials that played well in wealthy coastal enclaves. He had mastered the art of sounding compassionate while implementing policies that hurt the people he claimed to help. J.D. Vance came with evidence Newsom could not talk his way around. Photographs of tent cities housing 171,000 homeless people, census data showing 500,000 people fleeing California, business records proving major corporations relocated to other states, cost comparisons showing working families priced out of homes, crime statistics showing Prop 47's consequences, energy bills showing blackouts in the Golden State. And that photograph, that devastating photograph of Newsom eating $350 meals with lobbyists while Californians could not visit dying relatives. The receipts were undeniable. You cannot spin away tent cities when they are shown on screen, cannot explain away a congressional seat lost to population flight, cannot justify $24 billion spent with homelessness increasing, cannot defend electric car mandates while the power grid fails, and cannot claim to help the working class, while only billionaires can afford your state. Vance proved something crucial about political debates: authenticity and evidence beat polish and rhetoric. A working-class Marine who had lived struggle understood working people better than a trust fund governor who had never felt financial pressure. Someone focused on actual results instead of virtue signaling could show those results, and voters responded to that reality. The debate changed the narrative around progressive governance, as California went from being held up as a model to being referenced as a warning, from showing what is possible to showing what to avoid, from the California dream to the California nightmare of unaffordable housing, tent cities, exodus, and elite hypocrisy, because Vance just proved that hair gel and smooth talk cannot hide $24 billion in wasted spending and 500,000 people fleeing. Reality always wins eventually.